So as the shelling continues and NATO leaders sign off that increase in troops, what hope for a diplomatic solution? William Courtney is a former United States diplomat and former ambassador to Kazakhstan, Georgia and the United States-Soviet Bilateral Consultative Commission, which was set up to implement a treaty banning nuclear weapons tests. Mr. Ambassador, welcome. 1 month into Russia's invasion, the military onslaught shows no sign of easing. In your considerable experience, having worked for so many presidents, do you think there is still any hope for diplomacy?
There really isn't a lot of hope for diplomacy at this point. The fundamental decision that Russia will have to make will be whether to retreat or to go forward. This is a little bit like the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was some diplomacy between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev. It was fundamentally a decision by Premier Khrushchev to withdraw nuclear weapons that resolved the crisis. This has gone so far now in Ukraine that there really isn't a lot of bargaining that can take place. The West is imposing really draconian economic sanctions, and the Russians are facing military problems in Ukraine. It's been frustrating for the Russian military. So my guess is that the West is not going to make concessions of any kind that would involve a diplomatic solution that would still leave Russian forces in Ukraine.
Well, you mentioned economic sanctions. You describe them as draconian. Those economic sanctions are being increased, ramped up. How effective are they really?
They're quite effective at raising the cost of aggression. So, for example, in 2014, the West imposed sanctions when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time. The financial sanctions were the most serious. There are various estimates of how much those sanctions have reduced the gross domestic product growth of Russia from 1% to 2.5%, depending on various estimates. That has a significant cumulative effect. And the West has held on to those sanctions for 8 years. None of the Western countries fell off the sanctions. So I think the Russians have to expect that the new sanctions are going to be a lot more draconian, and the West is going to stick with them until it achieves its objective.
Beyond economic sanctions, is the international community doing enough to support Ukraine?
The West is providing much more military assistance than anyone expected before. In the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the U.S. took weapons out of its own military stocks and airlifted them to Israel because Israel was facing a military reverse. Now the West is doing the same thing, not just the U.S., but countries in Europe as well. So between the Javelins, the Stingers, and other anti-armor, anti-air systems, Ukraine is receiving an enormous amount of support. And perhaps even more important, the Ukrainians are effectively using the weapons that have been provided, in great part because NATO has been helping to train Ukrainian troops now for 8 years. So the support is not lacking.
There have been calls for a no-fly zone from Ukraine, which have been repeatedly rejected. Do you envisage a scenario where NATO would engage directly in this conflict, and what would the red line be for that to happen?
So it's a bit hard to speculate about that, but let me just say the no-fly zone, for two reasons, has not been imposed. One is the West has been concerned about directly engaging Russia, a nuclear power, in combat. And second, it turns out that it's not the most effective instrument. More effective are ground-to-air missiles that Ukraine is receiving. Stingers, which operate at lower altitudes, and then there are probably going to be more S-300s shipped into Ukraine, which operate at higher altitudes. Those are more effective.
Look, you have decades of experience in international affairs and global diplomacy. How do you see this crisis resolving?
I think it's going to be difficult for Russia to maintain its military activity in Ukraine. Already military experts are predicting that Russia is not going to be able to seize Kiev or Odessa. The costs are going up. NATO is now saying that up to 15,000 Russian soldiers have died in the first 4 weeks of fighting. That's twice as many as U.S. soldiers died in 20 years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. So this is going to be hard for Russia to prosecute successfully. So I think in the end, we're talking about Russia making some kind of a retreat.
Mr. Ambassador, good to talk to you. William Courtney, the former U.S. diplomat and former ambassador to Kazakhstan, Georgia. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.